Hi, everybody. Welcome. This is my NDSL webinar, and I've decided to title it Spirituality and Leadership. Just as the introduction, the title of the NDSL article or series that I chose is called Spirituality and Leadership, Research Supports the Connection by Susan Komives, Michele, Mackie, Tricia, Shalka, and Meredith Smith. It was published in June of 2020. I chose this particular issue because spirituality in leadership education is a passion of mine. It's something I think is kind of a missing piece of the puzzle in leadership education sometimes. I don't think it's really talked about enough or used as a tool enough. So when I saw this, I was very excited about it. I know it might seem like this isn't a direct connection to leadership program review, but I promise I will make that connection towards the end of this presentation. So yeah, that's the article I chose. So the first chapter, I'm just going to go chapter by chapter for this webinar relatively quickly, just to kind of go through what each one was about. And then at the end, I'll draw the connection. So the first chapter is called Leadership, Spirituality, and the Legacy of Helen Lena Aston. Jennifer Lindholm, the author of this chapter, describes Lena as being someone who manifests a quality that is best described as spiritual, that is attuned to some larger knowing, some larger faith that yield a paradoxical sense of both gravitas and freedom. So that was a quote by Jennifer Lindholm on Lena Aston. So Lena is this woman who wrote a book titled Women of Influence, Women of Vision in 1991. And she's also one of the contributing members of the team that developed the social change model of leadership development. So that's kind of who she is. And then on page 14, this is kind of the all-encompassing quote that I wanted to bring out for chapter 1. On page 14, it says, propelled by a strong sense of self and the clarity of her values, she challenged others to think differently, expansively, and creatively about how to be better and to do better. So that's kind of spirituality to me. Within chapter 1, there was this ultimate definition of spirituality. And I think it's a wonderful definition. So I'd like to keep this in mind as you go through the chapters with me. So spirituality, this is page 17 of chapter 1, says ultimately conceptualized spirituality as pointing to an individual's inner subjective life as contrasted with the objective domain of observable behavior and material objects that can be readily pointed to and measured. The spiritual domain, in other words, encompasses what one experiences privately in their subjective consciousness. Also in chapter 1, there was measures of spirituality. So there's a little bit of a list here, so I'm just going to go through them. Spiritual quest, it's a form of existential engagement that focuses on individuals' purpose and meaning making. There's equanimity, which is a state of internal equilibrium or mental and emotional balance. There's ethic of caring, which is pretty self-explanatory, but a desire to assist others. Ecumenical worldview. This one was a little bit challenging for me to kind of wrap my head around, but my understanding is it's an inclination to see the world as interconnected. It's a whole thing. It's almost like there's karma, but there's a personal connection and acceptance of everything holistically. And then charitable involvement is caring rather than, you care for others rather than just caring about others. So it's the action of caring. Finally, I also really did like this aspect. Chapter 1 talked about spirituality, leadership, and Gen Z. So they basically say that the ultimate goal of spiritual leadership is to create vision and value across an empowered team and an individual level, and ultimately foster higher levels of organizational commitment and productivity. To be honest, I kind of had a little bit of a problem with that definition because it's so fixated on the organization and productivity. To me, I think spirituality is more meant for the person to reach their full potential, to gain a better understanding of who they are in the world around them. I'm not necessarily focused on productivity. I'm more focused on peace and happiness. But they say that the spiritual approach to leadership requires trust and courage. So as far as leadership education goes, that's very important to have that, is trust and courage. All right, next we have the second chapter. Chapter 2 is titled Recognizing the Inevitable Intersection of Spirituality and Leadership Development. This wasn't necessarily that difficult to draw the connection to, in my opinion, but what this chapter did was look at all of, honestly, the struggles of being a college-age student today, and the fact that with these challenging, like acknowledging the challenges that students are facing today brings into the conversation the importance of leadership education and spirituality education and the intersection between those two. So that's, the importance of leadership and spirituality. Societal needs equals the need for spiritual leadership. This was kind of a relatively sad part of this chapter, but very necessary. It talks about rising debt. It talks like the cost of college and the rise of debt and the stress and mental health of students today, and how, given the struggle of mental health, that spiritual connection is really important. They talk about how there is a direct connection between academic performance and stress levels and anxiety levels. And so they make the argument that spiritual leadership, having those conversations about feeling connected, mindfulness, all the other things that are under spirituality and spiritual leadership can help combat those things, and that it's very important that that's part of the conversation. So that's that part of the chapter. And then we have spirituality as an active quest for meaning and purpose. Again, this is another part that was kind of self-explanatory, but spirituality is this multifaceted, unique, very intrinsic journey that everyone should go on. And it's an active quest. It's not something that happens passively. It's something that someone needs to actively go on. That gets coupled with their lifestyle, that is service to others, that's involvement in their community or in charity efforts. And especially in times of stress, it's very important to go through these steps. So, and then finally, the holistic development means all aspects of the identity. This is kind of like the concluding aspect of this chapter. And the quote that I really liked here is, if professionals in higher education profess to value the holistic development of students we serve, then we are obligated to consider all aspects of the student as they enter a critical time in the development of their identity. Hence why I put the puzzle piece here. I agree with them that neglecting spirituality in a student's leadership education is neglecting part of their being, and it's very important that it's addressed. So that is chapter 2. Okay, the third chapter, Spiritual Capital, a framework for spiritually infused leadership education and organizational spirituality. This chapter was a doozy, and it was very important, and it kind of is, in my opinion, the most important chapter of this entire series. So first, major statement, leadership is not materialistic. So the individuals who wrote this chapter do not believe that leadership is simply focusing on this materialistic concepts of individuals, organizations, and societies. They want to bridge this gap between the matter, the physical, and the spirit. So a quote from this part is, spirituality empowers individuals to face their personal and leadership challenges with new perspectives and strength and resolve. So it kind of just is this introduction of why it's very important to talk about leadership and spirituality together. Next, spiritual capital. So this obviously talks about spiritual capital. They define spiritual capital as the culminated and enduring collection of beliefs, knowledge, values, and dispositions that drive societal, organizational, and interpersonal behavior. So it's a culmination of beliefs, knowledge, values, and dispositions that drive societal, organizational, and interpersonal behavior. So that's spiritual capital. A vast majority of this chapter focuses on the founding of spirituality and leadership. They mention the founding fathers as, excuse me, Adam Smith from 1723 to 1790. He was a moral philosopher. Adam Muller from 1779 to 1829. He was a German political scientist who coined the term spiritual capital. And Max Weber, 1864 to 1920, who acknowledged religion and spirituality as a causal force in human behavior. So there's the founding fathers, if you will, of spirituality and leadership. Probably the most important part of this chapter, and if I'm being honest, I don't know if I still have a full understanding, is the spiritual capital theory conceptual model. I'm going to try and explain it to you the best I can, but I'm going to be honest, I think this is still something I have to kind of wrap my brain around. But the propositions of this model are, first, metaphysical, raw materials. So it's your inner competencies. They are essential for spiritual capital to emerge. Second is a formation process. So it's some form of education or experience. This underpins the effective creation of spiritual capital. Third is personal and spiritual resources undergo this transformation process. So this could be through meditation or prayer for some. Into spiritual capital. And then fourth, effective investment, meaning that the action of spiritual capital is required, which finally leads to individual and societal returns. So there's a need for spiritual capital, and that leads to returns on investment from spiritual capital. So that's a very basic understanding of this SCT conceptual model, spiritual capital theory conceptual model. Finally, this chapter talks about spirituality-oriented leadership development. It is very clear this chapter argues that maintains a traditional focus on the material and hierarchical objectives, then tensions will stay in place. This makes it even more evident that change is necessary. Although this fact is apparent and needs less convincing, the discourse around spirituality-based leadership education is apparent. Very few organizations have consciously operationalized spiritual capital in their business model. Leadership educators work with groups and organizations on how leadership is promoted, and evidence in collective settings, identifying and addressing spiritual capital of the group might bring those principles, beliefs, and values forward that guide the process and action of the group, and as it works towards their shared goals. So that was a very long, drawn out quote from the book on page 57 of chapter 3 that basically says that organizations haven't really bought in yet to spirituality as a form of education, or using spirituality as a way of educating leaders. So there's still work to do between bridging that gap. So that is the basics of chapter 3. Okay, chapter 4. I have to be incredibly honest with all of you before I start this review process about some biases I have. I don't identify as a religious person. I am a very spiritual person, but I don't have a belief within organized religion. So when I got to this chapter, Conceptualizations of Leadership and Leadership Development within Evangelical Christian Campus Ministries, I think my mind kind of turned off a little bit. I think oftentimes people believe that spirituality is religion. And when I've seen it before, when I start talking to people about spirituality within a leadership context, instantly their minds go to religion, to organized religion and organized faith-based religions. But to me, they're separate. To me, spirituality is a huge part of religion, but religion in and of itself is not, or spirituality in and of itself is not dependent on this religious aspect. They're two separate things to me. Interconnected, yes, in some ways, and not in others. So that was this chapter, chapter 4. And like I said, they're linked with religion, spiritual engagement, absolutely. A good chunk of this chapter talks about the nature and purpose, academic performance at university students, social integration. There's a lot of connection between students who do well in those aspects and their affiliation with religious and spiritual engagement at a university. So that is, they really talk about that, and I totally agree. And then they have leadership in a faith-based context. So basically what happens is in this chapter, they interview and discuss with students in an evangelical Christian campus ministry their beliefs on leadership. And they talk about how the nature and purpose of leadership is this calling to be a leader. And that's what these students believe, that you have to have a call and be able to motivate people to action, to pursue something better. And that's driven out of their religious beliefs. They believe the role and responsibilities of leaders. The primary role of a leader is a direction setter. So they believe that you have to have a mission, vision, and values, and it's their job, and they use God. So for them, you're supposed to be directing people to God, and your directives are given by God. And so they have this, you're a direction setter as a leader. So that's the leadership in faith-based context. And then characteristics of leadership. So again, their definitions and characteristics of leadership are very much derived from their faith as evangelical Christians. So they think that a leader must have a heart of a humble servant rather than individuals who seek power. That leadership selection and development, there's this testing is involved in leader selection and development process. That there's these 3 areas of leadership selection and development of faith, obedience, and integrity. And again, I'm not going to lie, I have a little bit of a problem with the obedience side, but we'll move on. That challenges in leadership. First, it's this natural inclination to be self-willed. Second is the temptation to rely upon manipulation, coercion, and bad tactics. Trying to think of what. So yeah, I mean, yeah, leadership is in all things, and this author talks about faith and religion in the context of leadership, which is an important conversation to have. I don't think it's not. I just think that focusing on spirituality, it can, in some ways, could for some students encompass religion, and I know that as a leadership educator focusing on spirituality, that's going to be a large part of the conversation, and that's very important. And if it works for the students, then that absolutely should be discussed and talked about and used as part of their spiritual journey. I just have an issue with fully relying on religion, because I think there are differences. I think if you fully rely on religion, you actually end up excluding a lot of students. So that's all. So that was this chapter. There really wasn't a lot on chapter 4, to be honest with you. It was kind of a short chapter. The 5th chapter, Interfaith Leadership as a Civic Priority, Higher Education's Role in Developing Bridge Builders, was a very important chapter, and I'd also like you to really think about it. Just as an aside, picture of that bridge is Deception Pass Bridge, like right outside my home on the island I live in Washington. So I thought it was very fitting. It's a picture I took of the bridge. It's very cute. Anyways, this chapter honestly gives a very detailed, awesome, step-by-step kind of roadmap for good practices around interfaith learning on campus environments. So campus educators cultivating bridge building. So bridge building, it's around this thought that diversity in and of itself is just descriptive. The more important question comes from examining how diverse individuals interact with one another. So it's finding common ground between these individuals. So it's more that there's description of diversity, and then there's the action of diverse individuals interacting with one another. They talk about how uniquely college campuses have this they're incubators for this democratic citizenship, that there's like tribalistic identities and rhetoric. Campuses have become primary like battlegrounds for cultural wars that simultaneously uphold very essential goals of educating students for engaged, informed, democratic citizenship. So there are these, I hate the word melting pots, but this beautiful salad of diverse individuals coming together where there is educational discourse, and it's a very important incubator for having these conversations, for bridging these gaps, for diverse individuals to interact with one another. And so they go into this conversation around why that's important, and why specifically at universities that's a unique aspect. So interfaith leadership learning. So there's several educational activities that influence interfaith leadership learning. The first was co-curricular programs that promote experiences where students engage in different worldviews. So that's pretty much self-explanatory. Co-curricular programs where students can engage in different worldviews. I, for one, had the experience of helping to run a multicultural center, and it changed me. It changed who I was completely. So that's just an example. And then interfaith minors and concentrations. I don't know if USM has any interfaith minors or concentrations. They might. I've never been a part of one, but that too can be important. So through these experience, students are given opportunity, to meaningfully encounter different belief systems. So that's what's important, to meaningfully gain a deeper understanding and appreciation of others. And that's through interfaith leadership and spirituality, of course. So best practices. There's three, they go through three. Experiences where students are challenged to rethink assumptions about others and reassess their own beliefs, as a result, engaging with someone of different beliefs. So that's the first best practice. Second, students who engage in discussion about religion or spiritual topics with faculty also show greater interfaith learning and development. So it's very important that there's this relationship with faculty where these conversations are had. And then third, brainstorming solutions to societal issues with peers of different religious or secular beliefs. So the focus on outcomes and solutions rather than continuing to just talk about how they're different. It's very important to also talk about the going forward. What does this look like? Finally, there's this IDEALS is what they call it. It stands for Interfaith Diversity Experiences and Attitudes Longitudinal Study. Interfaith Diversity Experiences and Attitudes Longitudinal Study, IDEALS. So IDEALS findings point the way to creating environments and initiatives that cultivate precisely the kind of learning within higher education, utilizing IDEALS research to enrich existing and generate new learning experiences. Educators can empower college students with civic skill set and spiritual development that has the power to cultivate a stronger, thriving American democracy. So IDEALS basically looks at students who went through those three best practices, that had those experiences, conversations with faculty. They were part of co-curricular programs or interfaith minors. They helped brainstorm solutions with individuals of different backgrounds from them, et cetera, et cetera. Over the course of time, this showed that it cultivated a stronger, thriving democracy, and that spiritual development also aided in that. So that was the basically concluding aspect of this chapter. Chapter 6, the intersectionality of leadership and spiritual development through mentoring. It's a very important chapter. So it starts with talking about what a good mentor is. So good mentors are known for their kindness, willing and able to make a significant and regular time commitment, knowledgeable in a particular field, experiences in some type of volunteer service, and highly regarded in their community and respected in their business. So that's the first aspect of this chapter. Second, they go into these two key elements of spirituality, which they define as interconnectedness and the quest for life's purpose and meaning. So then there's these two aspects of spirituality, and they really focus on the interconnectedness. That mentoring, again, I'm going to say bridging the gap, is a very important aspect of finding interconnectedness and for gaining answers for purpose and meaning. Then their main focus is on intergenerational mentoring. So two individuals from different generations mentoring one another, or mentoring and mentee relationship, is this commitment to community and positive feelings of empathy and caring for one another. It's this understanding. I know we've all thought about younger generations, or, I'm a millennial, and there's always the okay boomer conversation. So I think there's a lack of understanding sometimes between individuals from various generations, and it's really important that a mentor-mentee relationship between individuals from an intergenerational mentoring relationship can help to build empathy and caring for one another. We have spirituality through leadership programs. Of course, this isn't very important for this webinar. They discuss in length these four very important and necessary elements in order for a program or in order to teach spirituality through a leadership program. And so these four aspects are self-assessment, diverse and interactive topics, regular written and verbal self-reflection, and intergenerational mentoring experiences. So they put intergenerational mentoring experiences in there as the fourth very important aspects or elements of a program where spirituality and leadership are discussed. Of course, most commonly, this will come between the faculty member or the trainer and the trainee or student. So leadership and spirituality development are inherently connected. They talk about mindfulness, introspection, reflection, and service are realms that can be seen in both spiritual development and leadership development, and that by focusing on one, you can also learn about the other, and there's a lot of interconnection between the two of them. They also talk a lot about service projects. I know at USM we've all heard about or experienced ourselves service learning, and they go in depth about how that is incredibly important for students in order to be able to express themselves, to find common goals, to be fully present and engaged in the learning process. That service projects or service learning are necessary for leadership development and spiritual development. So that is chapter 6. We're getting there. So chapter 7, peer-to-peer leadership, mentorship, and the need for spirituality from Latina student leader perspectives. So there are 2 stories that are told of mentorship from an individual named Alexa and an individual named Paulette. They have great stories, but for the purposes of time, I'm not really going to go through the entire story. What's important about focusing on these 2 case studies and the type of reflecting writing is how spirituality influenced their careers and education within leadership. So both individuals had this huge turning point in their lives, and spirituality and leadership education were part of that. So honor student voice, environment, and struggles. So this really talks about one, again, the importance of mentorship and the need for spirituality and mentorship to be interconnected. But also this talk about how it's incredibly important in leadership programming and spirituality programming that students' voices are heard, that their environment and their life struggles are able to be brought into part of that educational process, into part of that programming. That the environment and the struggles that they experience have a direct influence on how they will define leadership and spirituality and the connection between the two. It's important that the program or the leadership educator or the mentor help the students take a deeper dive into their experiences, into their belief systems, into their own context, and they look at mentorship and spirituality under this umbrella context of leadership. So this whole chapter kind of discusses that. Chapter 8 was another really good chapter. It starts with this story by an individual named Dennis C. Roberts and the religious experiences and spiritual journey that they went on throughout their life. They had various religious experiences, including singing in a Christian choir. They were teaching in Qatar, where they was introduced to Hinduism and Islam. So had a lot of different experiences with religion and spirituality throughout their life. And what Dennis realized through those experiences was that spiritual journey and looking at the world through these various lenses helped them interpret the world throughout those life experiences. So the 2 outcomes were they got to see multiple spiritual perspectives as valid and useful, and that it helped search for meaning and purpose in life as being central to leadership. So it helps Dennis find meaning and purpose. It helped Dennis find value and validity in multiple perspectives going through these spiritual journeys. So Dennis kind of talks about their story. Next is this intersection of spirituality and leadership. So leadership is what we do, and spirituality is our being. That is the foundation of this chapter. Leadership is what we do, and spirituality is our being or who we are. And connecting what we do with what we are helps to see how leadership interferes with spirituality and how spirituality interferes with leadership and how they are very connected with one another. So deeper leadership, the definition of deeper leadership is leadership equals conviction in action. So leadership is a conviction in action, and spirituality is profoundly shaped by our early life experiences, often reinforced by later encounters as we mature. So spiritual discovery can have an impact on how we engage in leadership. Going through a spiritual discovery, thinking about the experiences we've had, can help in how we engage in leadership, how we define leadership for ourselves. Leadership educators should use the foundation of searching for self-understanding, actively exploring new perspectives, engaging across differences with curiosity, and summoning courage to act on beliefs in order to cultivate deeper leadership through the use of presence, flow, and oscillation, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So this spoke directly to my own passion for why spirituality is so important. Engaging in these foundational experiences with students has a direct connection to leadership education and to cultivating well-rounded leaders. So presence, flow, and oscillation. It's 3 paths towards deeper leadership. That's what they are: presence, flow, and oscillation. And I'm just going to go through quickly how they're defined in the chapter. So presence, what our emotional intelligence reads when we encounter a person who inspires respect, trust, and encourages us to follow them. So what our emotional intelligence reads when we encounter a person who inspires respect, trust, and encourages us to follow them, that's presence. Second is flow, the peak performance state of flow. I think some of us might have talked about this before, but it's when you are so highly engaged and challenged, but that matches your high skill and preparation that you can kind of like lose track of time or in space, and you experience emotional tunnel vision that blocks out distractions. It's kind of this equilibrium between I'm challenged yet very engaged, and when either becomes too much, something super easy for you, you're not so much engaged. If it's way too hard and you don't have the skills, once again, you can become unengaged. So if there's an equilibrium between challenging and engagement, that's flow. You can achieve flow. Finally is oscillation. Performance is enhanced when highly intense and engaged periods are punctuated for reflection and generate new ideas while at the same time offering the pause to renew physical and psychological energy. So this is, you go through a period of high engagement and learning, and then you take a step back, you take a breath, you reflect, you think, and you kind of find time to understand what you've learned and how that's impacted you. So that's oscillation. So that is chapter 8. Okay, and the final chapter, we've gotten there. Sorry this took so long, but the final chapter, chapter 9, is Spirituality and Leadership, Research Supports the Connection. And so this is a very, I thought, fantastic concluding chapter that kind of culminates all of it. So far this issue talked about defining spirituality, finding research around the importance of spirituality, making the connection to leadership development, leadership programming, telling personal case study stories around how reflection of a spiritual journey can lead to better leadership education and well-rounded experiences. This chapter really talks about the research behind this. So that there is a direct connection between spirituality and leadership, and that it's very important that this connection is made in leadership programming. So first, research reveals the significant influence of leadership and spirituality leadership and spirituality is significantly influenced by motivation, influencing leadership values, focusing on justice, and emphasizing the role of relationships and community. There's 6 areas of influence that describes how these areas converge as students develop their leadership philosophy and capacity. And those are through purpose, ethics, relationships, service, spirit, and most importantly, an all-encompassing motivation for leadership, love. So they talk about love as well, which I thought was very cool. So 3 major studies of spirituality. The first is from Komives, Mackie, Smith, Shalka study, which describes the 7 C's of leadership development. So they are consciousness of self, congruence, commitment, collaboration, common purpose, controversy of civility, citizenship, and change. The second study finds that spirituality was found to be among the top 3 college experiences that positively contributed to each domain of the social change model of leadership. And then the third found that spirituality was an important component of developing socially responsible leadership capacities that is further aided by other complex social behaviors that stand to further deeper interpersonal connections in the way social perspective taking, SPT, would. So it's very important to developing socially responsible leaders is through spirituality. Finally, the recommendations for leadership educators, which I also argue has a direct connection to leadership programming. There's 2 quotes here that are kind of long, but I think they're important to say. The first is, one important role that leadership educators can play in students' lives is helping to create intentional moments and experiences that create space for students to reflect and build their internal capacities to explore meaning and purpose in lives. So through reflective writing, mentoring, and service learning, leadership educators can create this space where students are allowed the ability to go through this internal journey, which is spirituality. Finally, what has been demonstrated above through literature, research studies, and suggestions for practice is how much richness is present for students when they are invited to engage their full selves in their collegiate experiences. This holistic approach includes attention to students' inner worlds, where they can make sure not just of the content of their daily lived experiences, but also the meaning of these moments. Our abilities to help students foster this kind of inner awareness and intelligence may in turn help to promote many of the other important purported outcomes of US higher education, including students' capacities to engage in socially responsible leadership. So that's kind of how it concludes the entire chapter, or the entire series, excuse me. So what does this all mean? I know that was a lot. That was a lot of chapters and a lot of trying to come across what was in the chapters. But what do you need to know? First, spirituality is directly connected to being a well-rounded leader. These chapters all but proved that. Second, leadership educators should use mentorship, service learning, and other efforts to encourage students to go through a spiritual journey of self-discovery. And that was mostly in chapter 5 and chapter 6. Through best practices. Third, you need to know that leadership programs should specifically make an effort to fill the gap of not just focusing on the mechanics of leadership and organization development, but also on the spiritual development and well-being of their students, not just focusing on deliverable outcomes, but on the well-roundedness and health of their students. There was that one chapter that talked about anxieties and stress, and how going through a spiritual reflective practices and spiritual journey and having those deeper connections and going through that self-discovery process can help ease that. And so it's very important that within leadership programs, there's this spiritual aspect to conversations. What makes this context unique? So spirituality is a deeper, more intrinsic way of understanding oneself and the world around them. Unlike other aspects of leadership education, spirituality has no one right answer. And by this, I mean that every student, as much as every individual is unique and diverse, has their own experiences, their own views of the world, so too will be their understanding and interpretation of spirituality. Given these readings, it can be argued that spirituality and leadership go hand in hand. But that means that from a program perspective, from a leadership educator perspective, the approach to spirituality education for students will also need to be incredibly diverse and unique. And there needs to be this understanding that how someone decides to go through their spiritual journey, to define what spirituality means to them, there is never going to be one right or wrong answer. For some, there will be this religious aspect of it. For others, they might even think that they don't believe in spirituality at all. And they might be very scientific, tangibly, if I can't see it, it doesn't exist minded, and that's okay. And so there can't be a one size fits all approach to teaching spirituality, excuse me. And, you know, an example of this could be like in leadership, we can talk about different leadership roles. You can talk about authentic leadership. You can talk about coaching. You can talk about, you know, defining these various terms of leadership. And there is one relatively right definition to what authoritative leadership is, as an example. But when it comes to spirituality, you can't have that approach to it. And so leadership programs that have a spiritual aspect of it, especially for a program review perspective, it can't be, oh, they check these boxes, thus it's good to go. You need to take it from, what do my students need? And it's more creating an environment where they can have autonomy and freedom to have their voices heard, to be able to reflect. And so that's very important to keep in mind. The context of spirituality within leadership programming means there is no one definition, no one right answer for students. The environment is key. The created environment by faculty or by the mentor or by the program directors allows for individuals to be able to define for themselves what their spirituality is. And that then leads them to becoming a well-rounded individual and a well-rounded leader. So that's why this is incredibly important. Programs will be very unique and diverse. And that's important to keep in mind as a program reviewer. Finally, program review for spiritual leadership. I think I kind of already said this, but programs will be incredibly unique and student program attendees will have more autonomy over their journey. I think that program leaders should be willing and able to allow students to define for themselves the type of journey they want to go on and what that looks like. It's very important that there are reflective practices, that there is time and space, encouraging service, learning, encouraging mentorship, all very important aspects, but students should also be able to have a say as far as something even as little as the physical space they want to be in when they reflect. So for instance, for me, I'd want to go to the beach, the ocean. I love being by the ocean. That's where I'd want to reflect. I don't want to be in a classroom to reflect, and students should be able to have the power to do that. It's little things like that. It's not just differentiation in the assessment practices, but it's differentiation in all aspects of spiritual education. I think it's incredibly important. You can say you need to have a mentor, but as far as the relationship you and that mentor have, the conversations you have, where you meet, all those other things, students should be able to have more autonomy over that. And so for a program review standpoint, I actually think a little bit more work will have to go into reviewing how successful a program is. I think it would come down to what type of environment they create. So yeah. So anyways, that's the end. This was an incredibly insightful issue to read, spirituality and leadership. I'm hoping that it's okay that I chose this topic because one, it's incredibly important to me, and two, I think it speaks to the fact that program reviewing can be incredibly complex and there is no one-size-fits-all approach to it. Spirituality specifically is a very diverse and unique thing to review, but it's directly connected to leadership. It's very important, and that's what this issue showed. It's incredibly important. The research shows that there's a connection that needs to be more a part of the conversation. And I know for myself as a program reviewer going forward, I probably am, one, going to be looking to see if there's any aspects of this in leadership education, but two, it's really shown me that every program I review in the future needs to have a brand new lens, a brand new approach, its own, every program has its own identity, has its own outcomes. The students are all unique and different. The faculty are unique and different. And there is no one size step by step, here's what I need to see in order for this to work. You need to dig deeper than that. So that's what this has shown me as far as program reviewing goes. So I hope you guys liked it.